So it just so happened that on Wednesday at noon, I gave a Bible study to the Interfaith Bible Study that has been going now for 20 years. That is Jewish and Christian. It meets at the Jewish Federation one Wednesday a month from October to April or May. And I have been teaching in it for 7 or 8 years now. And so this year, it began in the year that Bill Moyers put out his series on Genesis. And some of you may remember being stimulated and intrigued by his PBS series on Genesis. And so the Jewish Christian Dialogue Group in Rochester said, let's do the same. So they began by studying Genesis. Now in this 20th year, the planning committee decided to go back and look at Genesis 1 to 11 again. And so I was the Christian presenter, and Meredith Dragon, who is the new CEO of the Jewish Federation, was the Jewish presenter. And then there's time for questions. She and I did the overview of Genesis 1 to 11. And as I was preparing this on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday morning, I thought, gosh, this would be really interesting, some of it excerpted, for the congregation. So that's how this came into being. In light of the accident, it's even more appropriate, as I think you will see. So I began by noting that Genesis 1 to 11, those chapters, are sometimes seen as a prehistory, as a separate introduction altogether to what follows. The story of Abraham starts in chapter 12. And sometimes it's noted that the universal focus comes in these initial chapters, and then the particular focus comes in the following ones. But rather than look at it that way, I see many ways in which these foundations for all of biblical faith are laid here at the opening of Genesis. You've heard me quote many times my friend and eminent biblical scholar, Jerry Jansen, and he puts it this way: what follows in the Bible presupposes the reader's familiarity with chapters 1 to 11 of Genesis, because scene after scene receives its depth and meaning from the way it takes up the images and themes of these beginning chapters. Jerry draws our attention particularly to something that we've probably skipped over in our reading, and that's the presence of generational roll calls, the list of descendants. These begin in chapter 5, and then they just keep coming. We get them in Genesis 22, 25, 26, 37. We get them at the beginning of Matthew, and we get them in these opening chapters in 5, 6, 10, and 11. Now, you probably think of these as the begats. So-and-so begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so. As I said, we tend to overlook them because the names are hard to pronounce. We don't know who they are. They're very confusing. But really, any time that we come across them, if we think about it, we can't help recalling Genesis 2, verse 4a, which we ended our reading with this morning. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. That word generations is the Hebrew word toledot, which comes from the word yalad, which means to bear or to give birth. So the generations are the ways that there's been more fruit, more life, more birth, generation after generation. In Genesis 1, which we read, heaven and earth are fruitful places where the earth brings forth vegetation that can reproduce itself. The waters and the heavens bring forth fish and birds that again bless them, have the capacity to reproduce themselves. The earth brings forth animals. And then finally, towards the end, God makes human beings in the divine image. and blesses them with fruitfulness. Throughout all of this, the picture is one of divinely given power to receive life and pass it on through the blessing of fruitfulness or generativity, continuing to regenerate. The all-encompassing story of heaven and earth is fittingly summed up then in the word toledot. So I began to read chapters 1 through 11 with this lens, and I noticed something very striking. There are the creation stories, which are chapters 1 and 2, and within that there's the first mention of generations, of toledot. Then creation encounters curse, that's chapter 3. And then there's Cain and Abel, and that's chapter 4. Chapter 5 is a toledot, list of generations. It's the whole chapter, 1 to 32 in verses. Then there's Noah and the flood stories, and that takes chapters 6 through 9. And then there's another toledot, again, verses 1 to 32. Our editor loves symmetry. Then there's the Tower of Babel story, and then another toledot, which takes up the rest of chapter 11. So these toledot sections that keep coming in between less pleasant and sometimes downright nasty stories are a reminder that the fruitfulness and generativity of creation are continuing and that they never cease to be, even in the face of other realities. To see the evidence of renewed life generation after generation is to know that all the forces that seek to snuff life out are not prevailing. And you see the great relevance this week. The blessing of creation that continues to provide fruitfully and bring forth life witnesses to a divine reality that stands over against everything else. It stands over against murder in Cain and Abel, over against debauchery and wickedness in the world around Noah. Fruitfulness and life stands over against destruction, as we see it in the flood, over against fear and empire, as in the story of the Tower of Babel. The generational roll calls under the word toledot imply that the divinely intended governing principle of the world is the power of blessing. I'll say that one more time. The divinely intended governing principle of the world is the power of blessing. The message of these chapters, and in fact then the whole Bible, is that God is continually bringing about blessing and fruitfulness in the face of sin and evil, and that the divine intent for life and generativity will continue despite the presence of death and waywardness. As I pondered this message, made evident from those sections we tend to skip over, the lyrics of one of our more beloved communion hymns popped in my head. That hymn is "Let Us Talents and Tongues Employ." It includes the line, "Jesus calls us in, sends us out, bearing fruit in a world of doubt." These words, incidentally, were written by Doreen Potter, who was my children's choir director when I was 6 years old, and my family and I were living in Geneva, Switzerland. Her husband worked for the World Council of Churches, and they worshiped in the church that we did. I think that's a small version of toledot, a small version of generational blessing and fruitfulness, coming down through the generations and continuing to bear fruit. Bearing fruit in a world of doubt is exactly what's going on in Genesis 1 to 11. And that will continue throughout Scripture and indeed in all of our lives, all the lives of people of faith. I often think of the historical circumstance during which the rich narratives of the people of Israel were put together into one edited whole. Scholars believe this took place around the time of the Babylonian exile. I picture the Israelites sitting on maybe a hillside, looking around them in Babylon, grappling with their bitter reality in exile, wrestling with their understanding of who they were as God's people. They were surrounded by people with a different faith base, whose creation story depicted the world coming into being through violence, and depicted human beings as created to serve the gods. In response, our biblical forebears told a different story, one that affirms goodness and blessing at the heart of creation. One that shows God creating out of love and delight. One that understands God continually providing for the world. One where human beings are treasured and blessed to participate alongside God in spreading generativity and fruitfulness. They stood firm in their religious conviction, however easily thrown into doubt by other forces in the world, that the divinely intended governing principle of the world is the power of blessing, and that we are sent out to bear fruit in a world of doubt. The shorthand way of proving the presence of blessing and fruitfulness despite all else, is the roll call of the generations. As Jerry Jansen puts it, insofar as the narratives in between those generational roll calls show other principles and motives at work, the murder, the debauchery, the wickedness, the fear, those show other principles at work, and those threaten life and render it barren. So the story of heaven and earth becomes ambiguous, and its outcome appears uncertain. But this ambiguity is clarified, and the progress of the story is steadied by the genealogies, sprinkled throughout the narratives, which reassert the continuing efficacy of the original divine creative intent and action. One example of this assertion is the way blessing and curse are contrasted. Both Genesis 1 and 2 present the world and humankind as a place of blessing. Genesis 1 uses the word bless 3 times, and Genesis 2 paints that beautiful garden picture of total blessedness. The word curse comes up in chapter 3 in a story that reverses all that fruitfulness. A 5-fold repetition of the word curse then occurs in these chapters through 11. But it is answered by a 5-fold assertion of bless in chapter 12 in the call to Abraham. This signals that the agenda of what follows the story of the people grounded and rooted in Abraham and the descendants, that story is to counteract the workings of evil in the world. That's the agenda. And to restore the world to its divinely intended blessedness. So we've seen how the lists of generations serve to steady and clarify the narrative, in a sense to right the boat that is starting to keel over from the forces of the world. God rights it by being a God continually about the work of creation. If you were reading along when we read Genesis 1, you will note that I read, in the beginning, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. That is a better translation than what our Bibles tend to say. It is in some of the more specific translations. And I like that because God is continuing over and over and over to create. The end of that hymn, "Let Us Talents and Tongues Employ," says it really well. It paints a picture of fruitful life in all its glory, resurrection and abundance. You may remember the line, "Jesus lives again, earth can breathe again, pass the word around, loaves abound." Thanks be to God.